I'm talking to Gill Crawshaw, who's a long-time disability activist and friend, and also has, in the last number of years, been focusing in through textiles into the history of disabled people, particularly working in that industry, but with wider implications for us. So, Gill, take it away, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard. Hello there, everybody. Yeah, I'm based in Leeds and originally from Preston, so I'm Lancashire and Yorkshire. So that was one of my starting points with this was the textile industry of this region, because the textile industry was the defining industry of this area, of this region, certainly. And if we think back to the Industrial Revolution, it was the defining industry of the Industrial Revolution in this country. So that's why I chose the textile industry to think about disabled people's lives. Now, I started doing this, I'll just say, I started doing this when I was organising an exhibition a few years ago, which was called Shoddy. Shoddy was an exhibition by disabled artists and it used textiles. Now, actually, just an aside, the original meaning of the word shoddy is it's a sort of fabric. It was, if you like, an early version of recycling, where old fabrics and rags were ground up and the fibres were respun to make new yarn and new fabric from that yarn, and that was shoddy. But an interesting word to think about for disabled people. So when I was organising that exhibition, I was thinking about all sorts of things to do with textiles and disabled people and where there are links. And a question that popped into my mind was, well, I guess this assertion in academic disability studies, if people know anything about that, the assertion used to be certainly that come the Industrial Revolution, disabled people were forced out of the workplace. Before the Industrial Revolution, the disabled people had a role, had various roles in, that pre-industrial time of, I don't know, I've heard various things of, sweeping up, scaring crows, milking the cows, all those sorts of things. That was the idea pre-industrial revolution. Come industrialization, disabled people basically were unable to work, were unable to keep up with the pace of the machinery. And so disabled people didn't work. So that was sort of, going back to some of those classics of disability studies and academics. And they were saying this without really much, it seemed to me, without much evidence for that. So I started thinking about that. And the first thing I immediately thought about, what we know about the Industrial Revolution, what we know about those huge textile mills and textile factories, is that they were very dangerous places. They were places where industrial injury was par for the course, particularly in the early times, in the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century, and indeed throughout the 20th century. So, yeah, I was thinking about that time and thinking about, well, for one thing, we know lots of people became disabled as a result of industrial injury in the textile industry. What happened to those people? Well, of course, a lot of those people did carry on working. So you've got that cohort, if you like, of disabled workers. And there were a lot of those people who carried on working. And they would have carried on working because at that time they would have wanted to avoid the workhouse. The workhouse was where people who were supposedly, unable to make a living would have to resort to if they had absolutely no money, no way of earning any money, no way of making a living. Then there was the workhouse was the last option. And the workhouse was designed to be that. So the conditions of the workhouse, which you can imagine, it was a place where lots of people had to go and live and work. Older people often went there. Some disabled people, of course, went there. but they were designed to be terrible places where people had hard lives and where it was really supposed to be a last resort. So people would want to stay out of the workhouse if at all possible. And that meant if they had a job and they'd been working in the textile industry, that maybe, if at all possible, they would carry on with that work. And they would carry on with that work. You know, maybe they recovered from their injuries, maybe they didn't. And clearly lots of people didn't recover from their injuries. And we know this from a number of sources at the time. So there's various reports about, you know, writing about factory conditions, particularly in the 19th century when, you know, people were concerned about what was going on in the factories and concerned about the harsh conditions. And I think, you know, Engels, who wrote about the industrial conditions of workers in England, he visited and spent time in the north of England, and he referred to a crowd of cripples. And now we're going to, you know, if you look back, I should say, at, you know, anything from this period, then that's the word that was used. And that was the word that was used. Cripple was the word that was used commonly for disabled people, and oftentimes disabled people would use it about themselves. So it's a word that, you know, we use with understanding that it was the word of the time, not a word that we would use necessarily now. So yeah, Engels referred to a crowd of cripples, and he was referring to the workforce coming out of a huge textile factory. And, you know, there was doctors who did reports who were saying, you know, that, and remember, sorry, yeah, at this time, children were going to work in the factories as well. So children from as young as 5 years of age would be going to work in the factories. Everybody who could possibly work in the factories, in the textile mills, would be going to work there to earn money. And just because the industry needed everybody, as many people as possible, they needed a large workforce. So yeah, that's another story about the Industrial Revolution. But yeah, bearing in mind that it was children as young as 5, and very common, you know, that children would be working, and would be working very long hours and in these difficult conditions. So again, you know, young people's bodies were susceptible to impairments as a result of the harsh and hard work that they were doing in the textile mills. So I was saying there was reports from doctors. So doctors would be, you know, looking at groups of children, and, you know, one doctor reporting that, you know, over half of the children that he saw who were working in factories were injured as a result, were not just injured, but were permanently disabled as a result of that. Another source that we have for this sort of prevalence of industrial injury, I guess, was the reporting of parliamentary commissions. So as I say, while capital was grinding on, and while the mill owners were wanting to make as much money as possible, the Industrial Revolution was feeding that and was coming up with new inventions and new ways of making the textile industry even more efficient than it was, and making people, therefore, you know, were working harder. It didn't mean that fewer people had to work or that their work was easier. It just meant more people were having to work harder, work faster. So that was going on. But a lot of people were concerned about that, and were concerned about the conditions that people, children and adults, were working in the textile mills. So there were a number of parliamentary inquiries and other inquiries into the state of the textile industry. One of those was led by an MP from Leeds called Michael Sadler. So it's often called the Sadler Commission of 1832. But that wasn't actually sponsored or sanctioned by Parliament. So Sadler did his, quite a wide-ranging inquiry, had a committee, spoke to lots of people involved in the industry, spoke to mill owners, spoke to managers, spoke to local people in the community, but also spoke to people who worked in the mills. The following year, because that hadn't been a parliamentary inquiry as such, there was a parliamentary inquiry in 1833 into the conditions. And again, that spoke to some of the same people and more, a very wide-ranging inquiry. And there we have the voices of people themselves talking about what conditions were like. And many of those people, of course, you know, have become disabled as a result of working in the textile mills. So, as I say, I'm using the word mills and factories. They're often called factories, the textile mills factories, because they were such huge places, you know, and churning out, and yeah, and with different processes going on in those factories. So yeah, you had disabled workers who were giving evidence to these inquiries, and they were, you know, talked about the work that they did and how the toll that that had taken on their bodies, and sometimes the toll that that had taken on their young bodies. So, for example, if, you know, somebody was minding a number of machines, they might have to stop the moving parts if the thread broke, and they might do that with the knee on a regular basis. So they were getting commonly, you know, the sorts of impairments that people were developing were impairments of the legs and the knees and the ankles. And, you know, their legs were becoming crooked, and it was becoming more difficult for them to walk. That was because of, as I say, coming into contact with machinery. It was because they were standing for long periods. Many of the mills didn't let people sit down, even though that could be done. There might be fines for people sitting down. They were working very, very long hours. Several people talk about working not 9 to 5, but 5 till 9. So that would be 5 in the morning till 9 at night. Certainly many people are talking about working 5 till 7, with some time having to do extra hours. They'd be working 6 days a week. So all this was going on. So working long hours, standing up, having to run about between different machines, having to crawl under machines, having to do things, stretch, be in awkward positions for a lot of the day for a long time. So obviously this is going to have an effect on people. So yeah, people were able to give that evidence. Now, one of the important things about that, if we remember that these people, you know, were therefore a really, really vital part of that movement for reform, that movement for better conditions for the workers, for themselves, not just for themselves, probably not for themselves by that time, but for other workers and the people who came afterwards. So, you know, people weren't just bystanders in this. People were taking an active role, standing up. If they could, I'm saying standing up, they were, you know, making their voice heard, and they were being part of that movement for reform, and often in the face of intimidation from the mill owners or the mill owners' heavies, who would, you know, people would lose the jobs if they went to the committee and gave evidence, or, you know, the mill owners would send the heavies round and all that sort of thing. And they were told by the managers, don't go and talk to this committee. But some of them did, many of them did nonetheless. So they talked about those sorts of impairments from standing and stretching and reaching and being in contact with machinery. There was accidents, of course, with the machinery as well. So it's very common for people to lose limbs as a result of unguarded machinery that never stopped. If things broke, if threads broke, if thread needed mending, then the machine would carry on and people would have to mend it as the machine was on the go. There were often accidents in the early days, particularly then, you know, girls and young women would have their hair and their dresses caught in the machinery, as I say, because there was no guards to it. It's, you know, unimaginable conditions, really. Of course, I'll come on to noise as well in a moment. Another factor was the general atmosphere that people were breathing. The atmosphere, there was no air conditioning, of course. The atmosphere would be full of fibres that people were, you know, that dustiness that people were breathing all the time. And the temperature wasn't regulated at all. It would be phenomenally hot and stuffy in summertime, and then cold in wintertime with no heating on in the mills. So people got bad chests, people had, you know, problems with the lungs, and those could be, you know, serious ongoing problems with the lungs. But nonetheless, people kept going to work, and they kept going to work because they had to. They wanted to stay out of the workhouse. And yeah, as I say, and the industry needed them. The industry wanted them back. If people could work at all, the industry really needed, you know, everybody to be chipping in, really. And that was one of the reasons why people moved from the countryside to the city, because of the need for a large workforce. Yeah, and some people would be skilled as well, so they would be, you know, actually prized by the mill owners. They would have, you know, been working for a number of years and would have developed skills, so they were wanted again there. Also, people, you know, I mean, really did make every effort to get to work and to earn a crust. Their families would have needed it, they needed it, even to the extent that it wasn't uncommon for people to be carried or dragged to work by their family or their neighbours. And again, this is something that people talk about in those commissions, in those inquiries into the conditions, which, you know, so, I mean, while we're talking about a large number of the workforce, therefore, a large proportion of the workforce would have been what we would know and think of as disabled people, maybe then, you know, people would have had a different attitude about it. People wouldn't, you know, as I say, they were using a different term anyway. This was just how it was, I suppose, for people. Yes, you did go to work and people didn't think about it in terms of disability. As I say, certainly mill owners weren't thinking of you know, their disabled workers. They were just thinking of workers. They weren't making any reasonable adjustments. There was no health and safety or anything like that. So it's not, even though there was larger numbers of disabled people in the workforce, you know, we're not saying that these were great places for people to work at all, at very, very different times. But there was this movement for reform. Trade unions started forming. And I mean, this is, you know, I have no, well, no, you can suppose that a lot of disabled people would have joined those trade unions, because a lot of workers in the factories did join those trade unions. So we can imagine that, yeah, that those trade unions had a lot of disabled members as well. So there was that part of the reform movement.
Has there been any work done on the, you know, on the minutes of those early meetings of trade unions, or is that still something needs to be done, do you think?
I think that's something that needs to be done, yes. It's certainly not something I've delved into. No, I'm just going to make a side, just a bit of a side move, if you don't mind, that's still relevant to our overall theme. Because in this work that I've been doing around the textile industry, I was very inspired, actually, by a book called Disability in the Industrial Revolution, which is by David Turner and Daniel Blackie from a few years ago, 2018, that was published, and we can provide the links for that, because you can, online, there's a free version of it online. Disability in the Industrial Revolution is about disabled people. Its subtitle is Physical Impairment in British coal mining from 1780 to 1880. So that's another obviously important and huge branch of industry in the UK. And yeah, I only came across this after I'd started my own research. Somebody pointed it out. But Turner and Blackie were sort of doing similar work, thinking about disabled people in coal mining and showing that even in a hard physical industry like that, there were a lot of disabled people working there. And they've touched a bit on trade unions. I mean, they also point out, which is interesting in terms of trade unions and the trade union movement, that from early on, there was obviously, you know, concern for disabled members and, you know, sort of welfare provision for people who became disabled at work. But certainly, Richard, you're right, that's something, and I don't know what records would exist from that early time, to be honest. So that's something that, yeah, it would be interesting to look into. Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted your flow. Carry on, please.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay.
So
I'll move on to another group of people.
Yes.
Which is, well, or another cause of impairment, which was the noise of the factories. I think in that sort of earlier period, particularly, people were most concerned with, you know, breathing impairments, yeah, problems with the legs, mobility impairments, deformities, as it was called then, of the legs. That was sort of the thing that people were reporting. But of course, again, what we know about the textile factories is that they were phenomenally noisy places. And so noise was a big cause of industrial injury, deafness. And I'm moving on a bit in time, really, because there's more written about that and thought about that, I think, in the 20th century, but it would have been an issue for sure earlier on. But, you know, that, yeah, because that carried on being a real problem, a real massive cause of industrial injury right through to the late 20th century. And by this time, you know, sort of the 70s, then the textile factories were dwindling in this country. But nonetheless, yeah, deafness was, you know, very common. It was so common. I think that people just took it for granted, really. As I say, right through to the 20th century, it was just, this is what happened if you went to work in the mill. But, you know, some people talk about, you know, the noise of the mills was just so loud it made them physically sick. Some people just couldn't work there. It was just absolutely overwhelming, because there would be, in the bigger factories and mills, there would be hundreds of machines going constantly, and each one was clattering away, just one machine. If you've ever been to an industrial museum or anywhere like that where they have these machinery, just one is noisy enough, and in the bigger places you would have hundreds. So, you know, the noise was unimaginable. So of course lots of people became deaf as a result of that, and this was why various forms of sign language you know, were developed by the workers in the factories as a way of communication, because it was, you know, the only way, lip reading and sign language were the only ways that people could communicate. So again, once that leads you on to thinking, okay, that's great, you know, and I'll just say, you know, yeah, talking to a friend whose great aunt used to work in a mill on the sort of border of Lancashire and West Yorkshire. And she, you know, was a very good lip reader, very skilled lip reader from years and years of it. And again, you know, there was no thoughts of feeling sorry for herself or feeling, you know, thinking that she should do anything about it or should claim compensation, even though some people did later on in the 20th century. But it was almost being deaf and being able to lip read well was a badge of honour amongst the weavers. It showed that you were hardworking, and that you got this camaraderie with your workmates. And so, you know, and it's you know, distinguished you from the people who worked in the office and from the managers. So yeah, I quite like this, that you know, that workers actually were quite proud that they had this skill of lip reading, because of all that, apart from it being a skill, because of all that it denoted about being at work and about your colleagues at work and about solidarity really with those colleagues. So yeah, I thought that was great. But yeah, of course, you know, yeah, industrial injury, as I say, rife, and deafness rife. But that got me thinking about, okay, so you had many people who were becoming deafened by the industry. What about people who were deaf, who were born deaf, who were prelingually deaf? What about those people? Did they get jobs in the textile factories? And of course they did. They did do. And again, one of the sources for this, which is a local source to Yorkshire, is a report that was carried out by what was called at the time the Yorkshire Institution for the Deaf and Dumb. And this was a big deaf school, one of the early deaf schools in Doncaster, which still exists, incidentally. It's not called that anymore, as you can imagine. It's Doncaster Deaf Trust and the school there. But this was, you know, sort of a long-standing school for deaf children. And that was set up in the early 19th century. They did their first report, and it was a survey in 1844. And I can't remember the full title. It starts with the results of an inquiry. Basically what the report is, well, they wanted to find out what ex-pupils were doing after they'd left the schools, because they wanted to prove that the education that they were giving to these young people was turning out useful members of society, and that, you know, that they were educated and that they could take part in society. So they carried out a survey, and they carried out a survey of employers, of family members, of other people who might know some of these ex-pupils, to try and find out what they were doing. And they found out what a lot of them were doing. And this being Yorkshire, so the school was in Doncaster, which is South Yorkshire, but children would have come from around Yorkshire to that school because it would have been a boarding school. So, of course, being in Yorkshire and thinking about what jobs people would have gone into in Yorkshire, of course, many of them went into the textile industry and were working in factories. So from that report that they did, we can find some actual people who did that, who worked as weavers or worked as spinners or, you know, whatever. So, for example, I mean, and it's really interesting, for the whole report's interesting, whether you're looking at textiles or not. So you've got sort of snapshots. People were asked 4 questions about the ex-pupils. The ex-pupils themselves were not asked, by the way. It was other people who knew them, oftentimes vicars and people like that. But, you know, it was employers, parents, community members. So they're quite interesting snapshots that are sort of, you know, typical of the time, of that sort of early Victorian times, when people were, you know, sort of very paternalistic, maybe well-meaning, in some cases, maybe not well-meaning, but just, you know, condescending and a bit patronising, really, about people and people at work, these deaf people at work. However, we know that people got jobs. So one of these is in Leeds. I'm in Leeds. One of these is Sarah Hartley, and Sarah Hartley was a young woman who went to work in a mill in South Leeds, and actually one of her contemporaries at the school also went to work there. And you know, while the report about Sarah and her friend Jane, I'm saying her friend Jane, I imagine her friend Jane, 2 deaf young women working together in a large mill, surely they would have become friends if they weren't already friends from school. Surely they would have been, anyway, But that report about Sarah, and an identical report for Jane, says that by her boss at the mill, says she's not quite so even-tempered as others in the same employment. And you think, well, boy, you know, is that true? Is that, you know, a common misunderstanding around deaf people, that they're quick to get into a temper, and that, you know, that their sign language is misinterpreted as aggressive gesturing or whatever? Or if she was not quite so even-tempered, I mean, no wonder, you know, if there was just her and Jane, probably, you know, who knows what communication was like in the mill? Who knows how they were treated? Who knows how that person, a manager who filled in that survey, you know, how he treated her and whether he tried to communicate with her. So if she was maybe a bit more bad-tempered than the others, that's not blooming surprising, is it? So you've got these little snapshots like that. Another one that I'd liked, again, in Leeds, is George Thompson. The reason why George Thompson's interesting, he worked as what was called a handle setter. He worked clearing out the framework of a machine that was used in finishing the cloth off. I won't get into all the technicalities of it. But George lived and worked in Armley, and the place he worked was Gott's Mill. Now, Gott's Mill later became Armley Mill, and Armley Mill now is Leeds Industrial Museum at Armley Mill. So it's really great to know that there was somebody who was working in the industry, who was actually working there at Armley Mill, where it's a museum. And at some point, towards the end in a bit, I shall mention a project that took place at that museum, and a project that took place at that museum. But I'll just say the great thing about that report that the Yorkshire Institution did is it gives you names of people. Now, if anybody's doing any research or has done any research, you'll know this already. If you're doing research into the census, the early censuses from the 1850s, I think, onwards, would have a column where certain disabled people there would be, you know, that would be marked in that column. Not every disabled person, but certain certain impairments, certain labels that people were given at that time would be recorded in the census. And one of those groups of disabled people who recorded were deaf people, very often called deaf and dumb at that time. And that meaning those people who had been born deaf or who became deaf from a young age. So those people are recorded in the census. So once I have the names from the report of the Yorkshire Institution, what that means is I can go and look in the census, I can look that person up. Everybody in those times has very similar names. There's lots of George and Janes and Marys and Johns, you know, and the surnames even are very similar. But you know you've got the right person because if you find that column that says, oh, you know, yeah, that's ticked or it's written in that they're a deaf person. So that's from that you can find out whether people carried on working in the mills because their occupation would be listed. And then you can find out a bit about their lives, actually, as I say, where they lived, whether they got married, how many children they had, all that sort of thing. That's the ideal. And one of those people, and I'm just holding up a little zine here, one of those people was a man called James Scott. And James Scott was a deaf man who lived and worked in Horbury near Wakefield in Yorkshire. So again, that's just down the road from here. And the beauty of James Scott is that I was able to follow his whole life in all the censuses. He appeared in every census when he was alive, which not everybody does. People, I don't know, people move. There's not good communication, whatever. And this... so I made a zine about his life, and that zine was funded by Unlimited, I should say, thanks to them for that. And I wanted to show, as I've been wanting to show with all of that, and the subtitle of the zine, I said that he was one of many disabled people who contributed to the textile industry of this region. Because that's what this is about, is saying disabled people are here, disabled people are part of the world, and they're contributing side by side with their colleagues, their neighbours, their families and friends. And they're doing similar jobs and they're not dependent. In fact, so the story of James, in many ways, it's a fairly ordinary life. He worked in a warehouse in one of the worsted mills. He was a hanker of worsted, so that means he would have been measuring and packaging the worsted yarn. And he did that for his whole life. In that report from the Yorkshire Institution, his employer gives him an absolutely glowing report. And one of the things that he says about James is that he wasn't depending on other people. In fact, other people were depending on him. His mother depended on him for, you know, she was a widow, and he supported her for, you know, her whole life throughout his working life. And he carried on working till he was quite young. At the very, you know, towards the end of his life, he did leave work in the mill, but he became a lamplighter. And we know where he lived, and some of those houses are still there. He lived in, you know, what's an early version of sheltered housing now. He lived in an almshouse in Horbury. So we know all these things about him, and we can say, yeah, here's James, this was his life and this what was going on for him. And he was part of the world, and there was no question about that. You know, there he was going to work. So that's one of the zines that I've produced. If I can move on, to another, I said I would mention a project in connection with all this research. And there's another zine to do with that, but there's also a website. So last year, I was able to organise an exhibition, a disability arts exhibition in all the whatever your definition of disability arts is, this would fit that definition. I was able to commission some disabled artists to make some artworks that responded to the research that I've been doing into disabled mill workers, because I thought, well, I've been doing all this research, I've been writing about it, I've been producing zines, it's time for a creative response to that, really. I think, you know, that just brings the research to life a bit and just helps to engage a wider audience with it. So last year it was a big celebration of Leeds' arts and culture called Leeds 2023. So as part of that, I was really pleased that this project got funded, a project that was sort of based on disability rights, that was led by disabled people, and that was disabled artists making some new work. That exhibition was called the physical exhibition has come down now. It was up for a few months. It was called Any Work That Wanted Doing. And the work that the disabled artists produced was on show at Leeds Industrial Museum, and it was on show. It was displayed amongst the collection of textile machinery at that museum. And it looked fantastic. And the work that the artist made was really, really great. And there's a website, again, we'll share the link. There's a website which is anywork.org.uk. If you just search Any Work, you get all sorts of employment agencies and all sorts of things. But it's anywork.org.uk. And you can see there, and you can read about the artworks, and you can read about some of this research as well that I've done. That's all on there. So there's images of the artwork, there's descriptions of those images, there's statements by the artists, most of the artists read those statements themselves, and there's British Sign Language interpretation of the statements. There isn't British Sign Language interpretation of everything on the website, I have to say. So there's some of it that's a bit longer about the research, I suppose. And there's some easy read on there again of some of the key parts of it. But the images are there.
That sounds great, Jill. So we've been going nearly half an hour, well, more than half an hour. So what I'd like you to do in the last few minutes of this long piece is draw out the lessons of what you've learned from doing this work, which is very interesting and really dispels a lot of myths. And what you've learned and what else you think could be done to sort of bring the real lives of disabled people alive, really, to make people aware rather than the myths.
Yeah, thanks. Well, as I say, I think it proves that point that disabled people are everywhere. Disabled people are part of society, of life, are part of their communities. You know, that disabled people, there's this idea that disabled people are dependent on others and needy, which probably, started during those Victorian industrial times. That is not the whole story. But why do we not hear these stories of disabled people leading, useful lives? And I guess that's a question for all of us. Why do we not hear those? I'll link back to the exhibition, actually, because I think, through arts and creativity, we can bring some of that alive. So I talked about Sarah Hartley, a deaf worker in South Leeds. One of the artworks was by a deaf theatre professional working with a deaf actor. And they basically sort of, took the little bit of information we knew about Sarah's life and brought that to life in a video. But they didn't just think about those facts as it was an artwork. So they used their imagination as well. And we're thinking about what life might have been like for Sarah and how sign language, the sign language that Sarah and Jane would have learned at their school at that time, because it predates the terrible Milan conference that banned sign language in education effectively. At that time, they would have been taught sign language and taught in sign language at the school, how that was an advantage for them working in the mills. And actually then they riff off and think about, child safety and how they could have perhaps even taught the children who were working in the mill sign language as well to help them communicate. So I think, that's maybe not answering your question. I'm thinking about making it relevant and local because, just from watching that video, I think these creative ways of bringing history to life, from watching that video, loads of the audience were like, I didn't know that about sign language, I didn't know that about deaf people today. So you've got that going on. The title of the exhibition, Any Work That Wanted Doing, that was taken from the evidence that a man called John Dawson gave to the Factories Inquiry Commission of 1833 that I mentioned earlier. John Dawson was a disabled man from Leeds. He'd become disabled at work. And he was talking about, you know, how he was taken on at the mill for a particular job, but he had to do any work that wanted doing. He had to do any work that he was told to do. And I think the thing about just that title is how it speaks to a lot of things that are going on in society today. If we think about the workplace and jobs today and how there's, you know, the preponderance of precarious jobs and people on 0 hour contracts and people, you know, just doing these terrible jobs, whether they're, you know, suitable or good jobs or not. The other thing I was thinking with this having to do any work that wanted doing was people on benefits, and particularly universal credit, how on universal credits, I mean, you know, if you're expected to do any work, any work that wants doing, any work that there is to do to get you off that benefit, no matter whether that's unsuitable for you, no matter whether that's a job that you can do, no matter whether you've got particular skills, whether it uses those skills or not. You're just expected to get any job and get off benefits. And even if you've got a part-time job, and you're getting some universal credit, you're expected to get more hours and do more. So I thought it really sort of spoke to that. What I haven't done much work on, and I think could be done, and I think earlier, you know, we're thinking about the global industry and the global textile industry, and thinking what's happening to workers there, because the industry shifted from this country to other countries where we know that people again are working in appalling conditions, are getting paid a pittance to produce all this fast fashion for us, etc. So, you know, I think it would be really good to make some links with the global trade and the workforce. And again, you know, the prevalence of disability and industrial injury, which will be an issue there. So there's those issues. But I think, you know, thinking about just work here and around the world and what's going on now and what have we gained since those early industrial times and what's slipping away from us. And one of those things again is, you know, trade unions. Trade unions are dwindling. People are, in some workplaces, trade unions are not allowed. Amazon famously, and in other places people are just not joining trade unions because, you know, there's a lack of awareness of what a trade union is and it's about. So
you know, the quote you said at the beginning, perhaps it's a good thing to end on the Douglas Bainton quote and what your work.
So we do that again. Yes, I mean, so Douglas Bainton being a academic, a disabled academic in the United States, and what he says is disability is everywhere in history once you begin looking for it, but conspicuously absent in the histories we write. And I think that is so true. Disability and disabled people are everywhere, but are not represented in history and are not well represented, as we know, in contemporary culture as well. But, you know, and we need to change that. And I guess that's, in my small way, what I've been trying to do is to change that.
Well, thanks very much, Gill. And I'll stop this particular recording here.